There are moments when the soul, without knowing why, suddenly stops in front of an absence. Not just any absence, but one that creates noise in the silence of someone who was there until recently. A mature woman with experience, with wounds and with what she has learned, can also fall into this emotional abyss, not because she is weak, but because loving, even after many years of life, makes us vulnerable. When a man starts ignoring you, reacting coldly, or disappearing without explanation, it is not only the distance that hurts, but also the confusion that comes with it. The same question keeps appearing. Since when was I no longer important? The answer, as harsh as it sounds, does not lie in what you did or did not do. It lies in how our brain processes emotional separation. When someone pulls away, the limbic system interprets the loss of contact as a threat and awakens old memories, abandonment, rejection, exclusion. These are ancient wounds of the soul that, even after therapy or rational understanding, can reopen. That is why the impulse to chase after this person is not a sign of weakness, but a survival reflex. Yet this impulse, which might make sense in mature, reciprocal relationships, becomes destructive when silence, consciously or unconsciously, is used as a tactic of manipulation. Here many women make a mistake. They believe their worth is measured by how hard they fight for someone. In truth, every unanswered message, every excuse invented to justify the other's lack of interest, weakens the bond. It does not strengthen it, because love should not hurt chronically. What wears down is not only the relationship, but one's own dignity, and dignity, at a certain age, is no longer negotiable. That is why the first act of love, when a man ignores you, is not directed at him, but at yourself. It begins with a difficult decision. To stop chasing, to stop justifying, to stop looking for signs, not because it doesn't hurt, because it does hurt, but because your inner peace is worth more than a half-hearted presence. The challenge, therefore, is not to get answers from someone who is silent, but to hear yourself in the midst of that silence. Because perhaps that is exactly where your true emotional transformation begins. What one often does not immediately understand, male silence is not always the same. Not every man who withdraws does so with the same intention, and not every silence carries the same weight. For a woman with life experience, with past relationships, with scars that have taught her to distinguish between true love and mere dependency, this differentiation is not only helpful, but essential. Because reacting the same way to every kind of silence is often the fastest path to emotional frustration. There are at least 3 types of silence that repeatedly appear in adult relationships. The first type is testing silence. This is the most common form and often comes with a paradox. He pulls back, but does not disappear completely. He does not answer messages, but still views your stories. He does not call, but subtly appears on social media. Behind this behavior lies a principle of emotional control, a hidden experiment. How long will it take until she writes to me? Will she miss me? It is not about closeness, but about measuring his power over you. And when you engage, respond quickly, ask where he is or what is happening, he gets his answer. He keeps control. And the game continues. Then there is processing silence. This is different, more complex, and often has little to do with you, but with what he is going through inside. A man may withdraw emotionally when he faces work pressure, family loss, life crises, or inner conflicts he cannot cope with. In such moments, his withdrawal is neither punishment nor manipulation, but an awkward attempt to regulate himself. The biggest mistake then is to force contact, because someone breaking down inside experiences every demand, even loving ones, as added pressure. Here it is important to look closely. Has he also distanced himself from friends? Has he stopped posting? Is he avoiding everyone or only you? And finally, the most painful, rejection, silence. Here there are no questions left. He reacts coldly, avoids meetings, shows disinterest, but does not completely cut off contact. Why? Because he does not want a relationship, but still wants to keep the option of returning if he wishes. He keeps you as a possibility, as a plan B. Such men rarely say directly that they don't want you, but their behavior screams it. The problem is not that he doesn't love you, but that he lacks the courage to be honest, and that is crueler than a clear goodbye. Understanding these three types of silence does not mean writing a handbook for male behavior, but protecting yourself. When you know what you are dealing with, you stop reacting from the wound and start acting from awareness. And this is where a crucial strategy comes into play, the emotional mirror. This is not about revenge or feigned indifference. It is about respecting your energy, not giving more than you receive, and not insisting where there is emptiness. The logic is simple, but not easy. If he takes hours to reply, you don't need to respond immediately. If he cancels plans without explanation, you don't stay home and blame yourself, but make your own plans. If he cools down, you don't run to rekindle the fire, because love is not begged, not saved. It arises and grows, but it is never forced. If you have to force it, it is not love, but emotional fear looking for relief. Neuroscience shows emotional reciprocity calms the nervous system. Feeling that what we give finds an echo relaxes body and mind. But when the balance breaks and we give more than we receive, the body reacts with alarm, anxiety, cortisol, sleep disturbances. A small disappointment turns into chronic stress. This has nothing to do with love anymore, but with erosion. Setting the mirror does not mean being cold or distant, but quietly showing, I know my worth, and I do not accept less than I deserve. That means I too can withdraw, but with dignity. Because when a man realizes that his absence does not trigger despair, but order and clarity, the dynamic changes, manipulation loses its power, and emotional control returns to your hands. Important, this is not a game. It is not about pretending to be disinterested in order to provoke a reaction. It is about acting from inner clarity, not out of fear of losing someone, but out of the desire not to lose yourself. When a woman stops chasing and instead reflects back, not only does the relationship change, but her way of loving changes as well. And that changes everything, and it becomes especially powerful when he eventually returns, because men often do return, not because they have realized their feelings, but because they sense that they have lost control. No answer, no more waiting on the other side. That creates fear, not necessarily the fear of losing you as a partner, but the certainty that you are no longer always available. And that is the true test. Many women make the mistake of reacting with enthusiasm, restarting communication as if nothing happened, and in doing so they hand over the hard-earned balance they had regained, not out of a lack of love, but out of a lack of clear boundaries. True strength lies in maintaining the energy you built during the silence, not sacrificing your routine for his return, not rearranging your life around his presence again, but showing him, gently yet firmly, that if things are to continue, it will be under new rules. Without a change of form, there can only be a repetition of pain. And from a psychological perspective, we know the brain reacts especially strongly to unexpected rewards. If someone comes back and you immediately give everything again without reflection, he receives confirmation that only reinforces his earlier behavior. But if he meets a woman who is centered, who has clear boundaries, and appears emotionally stable, the situation suddenly looks very different. He can no longer take your love for granted. He must rebuild it. That challenges him, but it also sets a new framework. Remember, someone who comes back has not necessarily changed. But you may have changed amazingly, and that is where your strength lies. Not in closing yourself off out of fear, but in consciously opening up. Because healthy love requires two people who are whole within themselves, not one who disappears the moment the other reappears. Consistency does not mean rigidity, but respect for your own process. There are connections that neither begin with loud fights nor end with clear breakups, but that slowly wear you down. These are the on and off relationships in which he suddenly disappears and then returns with warm words, where cold distance abruptly shifts into intense closeness, like an emotional roller coaster where you never know when the next curve is coming. The most dangerous part of this is not the disappearance itself, but the hope that every small moment of return awakens. Often it is not conscious malice behind it, but simply that he has learned to control relationships through uncertainty. His ego feeds on the fact that you remain despite his absence, that he can leave without explanation and come back without consequence. This is not real stability, but emotional dependency, not on the person, but on the intensity this dynamic creates. Neuroscience explains this as intermittent reinforcement, the same principle on which gambling works. When the reward, a message, a call, a gesture, comes unpredictably, the brain releases more dopamine than if it came regularly. So you remain in constant alertness. Every unexpected message feels like relief, every silence like a threat. The result, you become dependent on someone who is not really present. At this point, many women begin to doubt themselves. Am I exaggerating? Am I too sensitive? Maybe he's just confused. No, you are not exaggerating. You are reacting normally to behavior that undermines your emotional stability. The danger is that the more you try to understand his logic, the further you drift from your own center. Such patterns cannot be dissolved by even more devotion, but only by a clear decision to exit the cycle. The so-called nuclear option is not an outburst of anger, but self-protection, blocking, cutting off contact, stopping the search for indirect signs. This is not punishment, but reclaiming your peace. It is a message to yourself. I deserve more than absence disguised as interest, because every time you allow a return without consequences, you allow chaos to settle in again. And one day, after enough life lived, enough love given, and enough wounds endured, comes the moment when you no longer trade your inner peace for emotional crumbs. One of the most important lessons in adult life is this: dignity does not always shout. Sometimes it shows itself in silence, in not responding, in not pushing, in letting go, because holding on is not always strength. Often it is a refined form of self-abandonment. There comes a point when a woman realizes fighting for love is not the same as losing herself in the process. The most common mistake is believing that it proves strength to remain available, to wait patiently, to stay open, hoping the other will eventually realize it. But the truth is, someone who experiences you as a given eventually stops seeing you. Not because you lack value, but because constant availability creates emotional blindness. Constant presence becomes invisible, and no one longs for what they take for granted. Neuropsychologically speaking, constant contact with unstable bonds leads to ongoing emotional tension. You are always waiting for the next message, the next absence, the next sign. Your nervous system remains in stress mode. Your sleep becomes restless, your concentration weaker, your self-worth lower. Because your body interprets this permanent uncertainty as a threat. And threat is not a state of love, it is survival. That is why what may look from the outside like coldness or distance is often nothing more than advanced self-care. A woman who decides not to respond to certain patterns has not stopped feeling. She has learned that her stability is non-negotiable, that her inner peace comes first, that waiting for someone who cannot stay is only a slow disappearance of her own self. In the end, what matters is not what the other person does or does not do. What matters is what you allow. Because even if you cannot control another person's behavior, you can always decide how you respond. And sometimes the most powerful response is not a word or an explanation, but complete absence, not as punishment, but to end a cycle. Because there is silence that feels like a prison, but there is also silence that sets you free. In the emotional life of a mature woman, there is a decisive moment, the one in which she stops asking, "What should I do so that he will like me?" and begins to ask, "What do I do so that I like myself?" This seemingly small shift changes everything, because it is no longer about being chosen, but about choosing for yourself. It is no longer about waiting for signs, but about creating a life so full of meaning that no absence can make it empty. When a man disappears, when silence spreads without explanation and without respect, the first impulse is usually to search for answers outside. But the real transformation begins when you turn your gaze inward, not out of wounded pride, but out of the deep need to rediscover yourself, to ask what truly nourishes me. Where did I stop being there for myself? because the absence of the other often shines a light on the places within us that we have neglected, not as punishment, but as an invitation. Building self-worth is not abstract, it is daily practice. It shows in your decisions, in your routines, in the way you speak to yourself. It is taking care of your health because it matters to you, not because someone is watching. It is organizing your finances because you want autonomy, not to prove something. It is filling your calendar with people, places, and moments that sustain you, regardless of whether someone texts you or not. From an emotional, psychological perspective, we know this. Self-worth is not created solely through affirmations or beautiful words, but by ensuring your daily actions align with your inner value. And this value does not depend on external praise, but on how you perceive yourself. When a woman feels capable, needed, loved by others, but above all by herself, she no longer requires constant validation. She can enjoy a relationship, but she does not need it to exist. And this is where something crucial happens. The other senses it. Not as a threat, but as an awakening. Because when someone realizes that you are no longer available out of lack, but out of free choice, the old power dynamic collapses. The one who felt securely in control suddenly recognizes that he may have lost something valuable, not because you became distant, but because you found your way back to yourself. When a conscious, mature woman has rebuilt her emotional center, her perspective on love changes. She no longer seeks intensity, but depth. She is no longer blinded by promises, but looks at actions. Her experiences, scars, and lessons have taught her love is not something you beg for or fight for. It is something that recognizes itself mutually, that is carried by respect, and that shows itself most of all in difficult moments. And precisely in this contrast between what she once experienced and what she now expects, many women discover an uncomfortable truth. Not every man is ready for mature love. Not out of malice, but out of emotional immaturity, fear, unresolved wounds. Many cannot sustain a relationship that requires honest dialogue, clear boundaries, and consistent emotional presence. They are used to connections that feed on idealization, external validation, and games of closeness and distance. And when they meet a woman who no longer plays that game, they often do not know how to respond. This does not mean you should settle for less or harden emotionally. It means sharpening your ability to observe, recognizing early signs of emotional inconsistency, and not getting lost in endless justifications. Because love is not just a feeling, but also a form of awareness. When someone behaves inconsistently, withdraws, or responds with selective silence, he is showing more than he says. The question is whether you are willing to see what is truly there, instead of only what you wish to see. From the perspective of emotional intelligence, true strength in a relationship does not lie in controlling the other, but in knowing yourself well enough not to accept destructive patterns. To love does not mean dissolving entirely in the other, but surrendering fully to the truth. And this truth sometimes forces you to let go before you lose yourself, to withdraw before you justify, to protect your peace instead of clinging to an illusion. In the end, the true filter is not who is there when things are easy, but who stays when he is not in control. Exactly in this discernment lies the foundation of real love, one that does not live on games but on clarity. There is a quiet power that unfolds when you stop negotiating your well-being. It is not anger, not revenge, not coldness. It is awareness of your worth. When this awareness awakens, you no longer need explanations for indifference, no longer need excuses for absences. You begin to live from a different posture, from a calmness that does not ask for permission, from a clarity that does not fight for attention, from a maturity that understands not every silence deserves an answer and not every return is welcome. Much is said about self-love, but rarely honestly about what it truly means in depth: pain, doubt, renunciation. Because choosing yourself does not always feel good at first. Sometimes it hurts more to close the door than to keep hoping. But if you do it out of respect for yourself, that closing is not a loss, but an act of dignity, a step in inner healing. And it is important to say this clearly. You are not arrogant when you protect your peace. You are not playing games when you remain silent towards someone who repeatedly ignores you. You are setting a boundary. You are making it clear that your life is not a place for half connections, that your time, your energy, your love are not bargaining chips, but conscious presence. Whoever wants to share your life must be ready to be fully present, not only now and then, not only when it suits them, but with the emotional responsibility you deserve. This stance does not make you unapproachable, but consistent. It does not scare true love away. It filters it. Because only the one who is truly ready to love from emotional truth recognizes the value of a woman who does not act out of neediness, but out of choice. A woman who does not get lost in the silence of another because she has learned to listen to her own voice. It is not about winning a game, it is about leaving the game, walking away from a draining dynamic in which you are constantly waiting for a reaction, because it is exactly in this exit, in this letting go of the control over the other, that you reclaim your own. And in that reclaimed space, something new begins, something that does not depend on him, but only on you. There is silence that wounds, but also silence that heals, silence that forces you to rebuild yourself from within. Because when someone ignores you, it does not only reveal his lack of interest, it also exposes your own boundary regarding what you are willing to endure. That is where the true transformation begins, not in trying to change the other, but in asking why you gave so much space to certain forms of love. Over the years, we learn to cope with disappointments in love by developing strategies, justifying, downplaying, hoping. And although they once protected us, today they can rob us of clarity. That is why the most revolutionary act of a woman who has lived through much is not to love more, to give more, to fight more, but to pause, to breathe, to look honestly and to say, this does not build me up, this does not honor me, this does not do me good. Because love cannot survive in constant uncertainty. It does not grow in ongoing doubt. It does not endure in eternal waiting. True love, the kind that heals, that carries, that remains, arises where there is presence, clarity, and reciprocity. If these conditions are missing, then no matter how much you wish for it to work, there will be no fulfillment. Reaching this point is hard. It means enduring the pain of what could have been, letting go of the illusion that just a little more effort would change everything. But on the other side of this pain lies something non-negotiable, emotional freedom. This freedom is not loneliness. It is the clear space in which, if one day someone comes, he will meet a version of you that is calm, healed, whole. A version that can choose without fear. Because a man who ignores you does not define your worth. He only shows his own capacity or incapacity to love. You are not here to beg for love. You are here to live in connection with yourself, in truth with your story, in respect for your feelings. To grow, to heal, to move forward, not to wait for someone who was never truly there. In the end, the silence of the other can become your greatest opportunity to hear yourself again, and perhaps in that you will discover that you never needed him in order to feel complete.